Recording. Hello, everyone. Allow me to warmly welcome you to today's seminar session, the fourth of the seminar series called Curriculum Studies in Canada. My name is Ying Ma, the UBC Postdoctorate Fellow and coordinator for this seminar series. I feel very happy to chair today's meeting. Today, we are very happy to have Dr. Kumari Beck from Fraser University to give us a talk. And each seminar will be approximately 1 hour, with speakers allotted around 40 minutes to give their presentations, followed by a short Q&A segment. With the permission of each speaker, we'll be recording each session, and they will become available on both of our website, curriculumstudiesincanada.ca, and our YouTube channel. And today, welcome Dr. Kumari Beck to give us a talk. And right now, Dr. Ann Chinnery will introduce today's speaker, Dr. Beck. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Ying, for your opening remarks. It's my pleasure and privilege to introduce this morning's speaker, Dr. Kumari Beck. As Ying said, Kumari and I go back a long way. We were graduate students together at SFU, and we've become close friends as well as colleagues and office mates in what we now affectionately call our clubhouse. But because of COVID, we haven't been able to be together in that space since March. Having known Kumari this long, I could easily fill an hour talking about her research and scholarly accomplishments and the personal qualities that make her a treasured colleague, an esteemed scholar, and a much sought after graduate student supervisor. But since the main purpose of our being here today is for you to hear Kumari's presentation, I'm just going to say a few words to introduce you to her work and then turn it over to Kumari. So briefly, Kumari's research focuses on international education and the internationalization of higher education. In particular, she investigates everyday practices of internationalization and our knowledge about internationalization as workers in higher education settings, including teaching and learning in global higher education, globalization and higher education, and what it means to internationalize the curriculum. Her research, therefore, has clear implications for curriculum theory, especially when we look at how post-colonial scholarship can push back against the neoliberal orientation woven into much of the current discourse on internationalization and international education. Now, while making contributions to the theoretical literature on internationalization is important to Kumari, I think she is most committed to research that informs practice and to breaking down the traditional divide between theory and practice within internationalization. And one example of this commitment to scholarship that makes a difference on the ground is that Kumari devotes considerable personal time and energy to international development through her involvement and leadership in the NGO Susila Dharma International Association. Now, in addition to her individual program of research, Kumari and another of our colleagues who's here this morning as well, Rumiana Ilieva, founded SFU's Center for Research on International Education, which is called CRIE, C-R-I-E, and they continue to serve as co-directors. The center has become an active hub for research and a home base for interdisciplinary research on international education, both within our faculty and beyond. Kumari has also served as president of CIESC, which is the Comparative and International Education Society of Canada, and she's currently editor of the journal Comparative and International Education, which is the official journal of the CIESC. Now, there's so much more I could say, but let me turn it over in a moment to Kumari to give her presentation, which is called Storying Curriculum as International Text. In her paper, Kumari explores Ted Aoki's notion of a curricular landscape of multiplicity in the context of international education. Kumari takes up Aoki's work to draw connections among the spaces of the inter that mark her own schooling, teaching, and research on the internationalization of higher education. And her paper is also informed by David Smith's work and post-colonial scholarship. So now, Kumari, over to you.
Well, thank you, Anne, for the very kind and generous introduction. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the place that I live. I'm grateful to be living and now working on the stolen lands of the Kwantlen people here in Fort Langley. And I have the privilege of being refreshed and inspired by the beauty of the place that I can now call home. I work at Simon Fraser University, whose campuses are located on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Musqueam, Coquitlam, Katzie, and other nations. I speak also here as an immigrant settler. My experiences as an immigrant raising biracial children inform my understanding of North-South Indigenous settler relations playing out under the formal narrative of multiculturalism. I also acknowledge how conveniently I slip into settler identity and have much to learn about recognizing and learning about Indigenous ways of being and knowing. My thanks also to Drs. Pinar and Phelan for bringing us together. Thank you for this in this Canadian Curriculum Studies Symposium and for the invitation to participate. And to Dr. Ma for coordinating and facilitating these sessions and your team. Since the time I accepted this invitation, at the time most enthusiastically, life as we know it has changed drastically. I'm feeling an emptiness, a sense of paralysis that started to take hold during the Black Lives Matter protests and now building in this week of the US presidential election. The subtitles in Dr. Pinar's book, What is Curriculum, read like an account of our present moment, the miseducation of the American public, reconstructing the private and public spheres in curriculum and teaching, betrayal, keeping hope alive, and waking up from the nightmare that is the present. The process of writing this paper, which is still unfinished, has been difficult. We are in crises of various kinds, and yet we are trapped within the expectation that we carry on our work in the academy regardless. So yes, I am feeling vulnerable as I gather myself for this presentation and not really understanding fully where this vulnerability resides. I have selected 5 segments from my paper to share with you today. They reflect some of the key ideas that I've explored and I'm still engaged with in my scholarship. I've titled them Preludes. A prelude is an introduction to something more important to come, and I suggest in this case is in the making, unknown. Prelude 1. The winter's evening settles down with smells of steaks and passageways. 6 o'clock. The burnt out ends of smoky days. And now a gusty shower wraps the grimy scraps of withered leaves across your feet and newspapers from vacant lots. The showers beat on empty blinds and chimney pots, and at the corner of the street, a lonely cab horse steams and stamps. And then the lighting of the lamps. That's from T.S. Eliot's Preludes. I still hear the flat, almost monotone of T.S. Eliot's voice reading these and other poems, the slight crackle of the occasional speck of dust on the surface of the vinyl amplified on the speakers. The British Council Library was just a few doors down from my father's photographic studio in Gull Face, Colombo, and he would select an album or two to bring home every week. There were recordings of famous British actors and actresses reading Chaucer, Shakespeare, Wordsworth, Keats, Eliot, G.K. Chesterton, and a host of other poems, plays, and essays. At night, our home was filled with the sound of classical music from our own extensive collection of records. In school, my aesthetic sensibilities were further refined to appreciate the best of British literature, art, and theater, Greek pottery, architecture, and plays, the classics as they were called. the histories of ancient Rome, Greece, and England, and in everything we learned, the canon. I am called into existence and defined by what is now my first language. I would say I had an excellent education that has enriched my life. I was internationalized long before I left home. Along the way, there were some moments of dissonance. The first was at university, where I followed my passion for English literature. University education in my home country is free, which made access to higher education broad-based. But studying English lit appealed only to a very small minority of students, mostly from the capital city and a few other urban centers. I found myself on a campus that better reflected the social groups of the country than I had previously been exposed to in the school I attended for elementary and secondary schooling. As I tried with my fellow English department students to hide markers of privilege and make new friends from other disciplines, I became painfully aware of the costs of my education and the implications of the larger histories of colonialism that had been wreaked on our country for almost 500 years. As the world around me expanded, I was introduced to politics and socialism, class, gender, religious, and other differences that were at play. And at the same time, I struggled to resolve the contradictions inherent in pursuing an English degree, sitting in a half-walled building with a corrugated metal roof that was the English department, space shared with stray dogs and broken furniture. We used to call it the doghouse. Around us, we could feel the tensions of social unrest, the undercurrents of student rebellion prevailing from a recent countrywide insurrection, and of ethnic divisions that were to erupt a few years later. It was a difficult and necessary lesson in unequal relations, and I was beginning to see the between spaces, and a growing ambivalence about entering those spaces. Ambivalence, as theorized by Homi Bhabha, produces the colonized as a social reality, which is at once an other and yet entirely knowable and visible. And the otherness, quote, is at once the object of desire and derision, close quote. My growing awareness of these social realities was just that, however, an awareness, but nothing that disrupted my views of what knowledge was worth knowing. My first years of being a teacher in my home country illustrated just how successfully I had become one of Lord Macaulay's children. Lord Macaulay, being a member of British Parliament, a member of, I kid you not, the Board of Control, which supervised the administration of India by the East India Company. Macaulay, on behalf of the British government, inaugurated a national system of education. In his now famous, or rather infamous, Minute on Education, he argued for the importance of establishing, quote, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. To that class, we may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects of the country, to enrich those dialects with terms of science borrowed from the Western nomenclature, and to render them by degrees fit vehicles for conveying knowledge to the great mass of the population, close quote. So I joined that army of happy knowledge conveyors, teaching the curriculum carefully, reproducing the classrooms of my own teachers. The English canon was delivered with passion, and I never yet strayed far from the script. It was a quintessential curriculum as planned. But I, not some distant ministry official, was cementing that plan through mimicry, itself prompted by some unconscious or conscious recognition that I could never be the copy of the original. And this is a quote from Bhabha. Almost the same, but not quite. Almost the same, but not white. This colonial foundation was an important added layering of complex terrain to Aoki's CNI landscape. The coercion to mimic maintains control. Quote, mimicry repeats rather than represents. This recognition that I will never be quite the same maintains the power of the colonial curriculum as planned and the colonization of the mind referred to by Ashish Nandi that informs my becoming. Prelude 2, resistance. Ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. That's from Leonard Cohen's The Anthem. The cracks and the breakthroughs in my teaching came many years later in a private post-secondary classroom here in BC. My immigrant status and its accompanying lack of Canadian work experience had, up until that time, denied me work in Canada. And yet, in this case, my English degree, and more importantly, the fact that I spoke English without an accent, opened the door to a 3-week teaching assignment. I was hired in a temporary position to teach English to new immigrants who were following a federal work program in the trades, people who were carpenters and mechanics. I was handed a manual on the first day of my class with instructions that I stick to the worksheets, the sequencing, and the lesson plans because they'd been carefully designed by someone with a PhD. All I had to do was to ensure that in 3 weeks, my students could read and follow along their trades manual when they joined the regular program. As I faced that first group of carpenters, all men, I went blank. I can't quite point to where and how those cracks first appeared. Whether it was a discomfort of forcing myself to wear a borrowed gray tweed suit to appear the part, or the fact that I had been eager to accept a minimum wage contract, or, and this is what I think more settled in, a feeling with this diverse group of men who, like me, were wondering how we came to be sitting in this gray and gloomy place far from home. Something snapped, and I slowly pushed aside the teaching manual authored by someone with a PhD. What happened next that day and for the rest of the 3 weeks was an opening up on my part, quote, to the fundamental way in which we all experience life. And as Aoki says, a living in the tensionality, a tensionality that emerges in part from indwelling in the difference between two curricula, the curriculum as planned and the lived curriculum. I witnessed the struggles, confusion, frustration of adult newcomers to Canada as they tried to assimilate into their new community and still maintain some sense of their own identity. Along with them, I too was learning about the boundaries, positionings, and contradictions encountered through the act of becoming a Canadian. To be here, we had to give up parts of ourselves to be invisible and to be known only in the unitary terms of our newness, our foreignness, or our exotic national identity. As Ashcroft writes, the successful disruption of the territory of the dominant occurs not by rejecting or vacating that territory, but by inhabiting it differently. And inhabited differently we did. We transformed into a noisy, busy, lively group of 16 men and a woman, connected through our common experiences of being here. We listened to each other's unique life stories, became vulnerable with one another, listened to CBC, took turns to facilitate conversations on such topics as what I hate about Canada and how to defeat stupid English. They wrote, they composed, they sang, taught one another, they laughed. Multiplicity is not a noun. One interpretation of the transformation in this classroom could be read as deviance. As Baba argues, mimicry is at once resemblance and menace. And the uncertainty in whether it is mimicry, following the plan as instructed, Or mockery, the noisy classroom, subverts authority. The sly weapon of anti-colonial civility, an ambivalent mixture of deference and disobedience. More importantly, this experience and my time with many other groups of new immigrants facilitated my own shift from the CNI landscape to a CNC landscape. Thanks to the generous sharing and participation of each of those students in this wild experiment, I grew to appreciate how each of their lived experiences are the curriculum, recognizing the social realities occupied by both teacher and students. The lived lives of both teacher and students understood, as Aoki describes, as, quote, a language of humility, as a curriculum has to await the invitation of the teacher and students in the classroom. Prelude 3, the field. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go, bind your sons in exile to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folks and wild, your new caught, sullen peoples, half devil and half child. And that's from Rudyard Kipling's 1899 poem called The White Man's Burden. I don't remember making a conscious decision to be a scholar in international education. There was an assumption that this was a natural fit. At the start of graduate school, I was still working in immigrant settlement programs, as well as in the international teacher education program at SFU. It was suggested many times that since this is an area of my work, and because I was from away, I had come from away, that international education would be a good fit for my studies. And as it turns out, for my academic career, I acquiesced. For now, I want to avoid the foray into the distinctions between international education, internationalization, global education, comparative and international education common to scholars in our field, noting that there is a somewhat obsession with definitions and distinctions that masks the more important issues that are to be explored in our area of scholarship. In transitioning into the internationalization of curriculum, bear with me as I highlight very briefly the internationalization of higher education here in Canada that has a bearing on how we conceive of internationalizing the curriculum within the field. The last 3 decades have seen a rapid growth in the internationalization of higher education, which needs to be understood alongside the conditions of globalization and the consequential market orientation of higher education, colonial context of history, culture, and power, and driven largely by the recruitment of income-generating international students to higher education institutions, mostly in the global north. So international education in the guise of internationalization has become an industry here in Canada and elsewhere. So how did we get here? The beginnings of internationalization here in Canada in its contemporary form, referred to at the time as international education, can be traced to international development assistance following the Second World War, form of technical expertise, program and curricular development, and student-faculty exchange programs, establishing the somewhat stereotypical Canadian identity as a benevolent helper. International activity was focused on North-South relations and was known as humane internationalism. These policies also promoted the inflow of international students from the global South and visits of Canadian faculty to universities in the global South, reproducing colonial patterns of international mobility, the universalization of values and knowledge of the global North, and reifying students from the South as objects of development. As scholars have noted, the implications and ethics of transferring Western technologies into other cultural settings were not discussed in those early days of international education. And colonialism and imperialism are seldom discussed directly. And in the rare instances that they are, international education activities are absolved of such possible negative outcomes. Tracing international engagement from those beginnings through the 1990s, one can see a shift away from a service orientation, itself not without critique, to a market model, the aid to trade. It's no accident, of course, that international education in Canada is listed federally under the Ministry of Trade. This shift, driven at the institutional level through intensified student recruitment, is significant in the way that it has shaped and continues to influence higher education policy and practice, and I would argue the notion of curriculum itself. Developments in higher education appear to provoke innovation and creativity in how we respond to global change, but unintended consequences are apparent, such as the deepening inequities related to access, brain drain for low-income countries, with benefits accruing to universities and nations of the global north, and the reproduction of hierarchical north-south relations so inherent in the so-called neutrality of the knowledge society. There has been a steady stream of critique and calls for change from internationalization scholars, including the growth of a recent group of scholars calling themselves critical internationalization studies, an area of studies that problematizes the overwhelmingly positive, celebratory, and depoliticized approaches to internationalization of higher education. With the onset of the pandemic, the end of internationalization of higher education as we know it may be here sooner than anyone thought possible, and hardly as a metaphor. It is critical, I would argue, that we use this enforced hiatus of mobility as a time for reflection of what internationalization has come to mean, a time where vulnerability arising from the current situation may lead us to important insights about the orientation, direction, and practices of internationalization in the larger context of human relations, colonial violence, human, non-human relations, and planetary destruction. Even with a more radical line of critique calling for the imagining of internationalization otherwise, this discussion and critique has not touched the area of internationalization of curriculum within international education. So as we know, there's an abundance of scholarship on the effects of globalization on curriculum, and also within curriculum studies by scholars such as Ted Aoki, David Smith, Noel Goff, Janet Miller, Hong-Yu Wang, to name a few. But internationalization studies has maintained itself in its own compartment. Conversations on curriculum are dominated largely by discussions on intercultural understanding and competencies, and a celebratory one world discourse that mirrors our own notions of multiculturalism here. So definitions of what constitutes internationalizing the curriculum have largely driven this conversation towards this instrumental orientation. For example, an infusion approach, which is based on the assumption that a curriculum already exists. And an infusion of international or global content will simply internationalize it. Another approach has been to call it internationalized learning. For example, integrating substantive knowledge about the sociocultural context of other societies, development of skills, and how one maintains one's cultural integrity while understanding and working with others. So more recently, Betty Lisk who's widely recognized for her work in internationalizing of the curriculum, has defined it as the incorporation of an international and intercultural dimension into the content of the curriculum, as well as the teaching, learning processes, and support services of a program of study. She explains further, it should be more than just content, that students need to develop their ability to think critically and develop their intercultural competence and their problem-solving skills. So it has come down to this: skills, competencies, and content. Curriculum has become a thing, and teachers are curriculum implementers. All the while, the richness afforded by curriculum studies, flourishing by the way of this opening up of internationalization of curriculum studies, remain largely untapped, ignored, and even deemed irrelevant. You may sense my feeling of frustration and alienation, both as a scholar and as a teacher. Outside of the comparative and international education community, I cannot bring my curriculum studies self to the conferences and journals on international education. And I feel like I'm on the margins of curriculum studies, which is originally my academic home, because the pursuit of my scholarship in international education has meant that I've had to leave behind a more serious engagement with curriculum studies. So navigating the inter in this case has taken a toll. Prelude 4, Pedagogic Reaching. A warm July in Sendai, third week in this unknown city, the people in similar attire walking hurriedly look different. Their language, food, customs, signboards, all alien to me. The only consolation was multicolored cosmos flowers and hydrangeas by the roadside to the campus, which filled my heart with inexplicable joy. It is in the same time of each year that they bloomed in our garden. It was like meeting a long-lost friend in this unknown land. It's a poem called Known Among Unknown by Sri Lankan poet Ayoma Wijewardena. For 12 years, I taught in a master's program that was designated international here at Simon Fraser University. That is, it was designed specifically for international students. And the program was a Master of Education in teaching English as an additional language. Students went through the program in a cohort model. I taught an elective course called Current Issues in Curriculum and Pedagogy, which most students in the cohort signed up for. I begin the class, as I do with all of my classes, by asking the students, so what would you like to learn? In many of my classes, the question opens up all kinds of conversations among us and is an important start to building relationships. In this class, however, the question sometimes has this unsettling effect. Often there is a silence, not a reflective silence or a contemplative moment, but a downright weighty silence. So I wait, letting the discomfort of the moment provoke someone to speak up. I then try to expand the question. When you chose to take this class, what did you think you'd be learning, and what were you hoping to learn? What are you curious about? I then have to prompt students with a draft reading list and topics for the course. I discover later in my student reflections and in the course evaluations the impact of this opening questions. For some, it went like this, and it said the preferred outcome, as we like to say. What I want to say is that I did appreciate that I had a chance to work on what truly interests me. I feel freer and learning becomes more interesting to me. Or another one like this. I wondered what I would gain from this course as it covered such a broad range of topics. Other classes seemed specific. Is it too open, I thought. I quickly learned that this was to my advantage as I was able to use the ideas and apply them specifically to my teaching context, rather than learn a specific context and then try to see where they fit in my practice. Of particular interest to me has been reading Aoki and thinking about the beingness of teaching. Some students feel stuck. Says one, I'm struggling between understanding what it is I should be learning and what it is I want to be learning. Through the progression of responses, I could see the onset of judgment creeping in. I was puzzled when the professor asked us what we want to learn. As a teacher, I have to know what's best to teach my students. I cannot neglect so many important aspects of curriculum, and I must do what is best for my students. And then the note of anger that the professor is unprepared, disorganized, and wasting their time. I just wished, said one, that she had spent more time imparting her knowledge. A drawback of this teacher is that her attitude towards this course is not serious enough. She did not have a systematical plan for this course, making the classes too casual and too loose. So these latter judgments, critical of my perceived lack of teaching ability and neglect of my students, were a little harsh to read. more so because the course was heavy on Aoki. The question posed by Cynthia Chambers, what is the significance of inviting people to take up what really matters to them, took on new meaning. The invitation that had worked so magically in my class of carpenters did not reach these students. So how should I follow up on that invitation to understand what matters to my students? I began my inquiry with David Smith's question: what might constitute an appropriate teacherly response to globalization in the midst of its unfolding complexity? Smith's approach to conceptualizing teaching in global times is framed around a response to issues such as delocalization, the pervasive logic of the market, and its discourse of competitiveness. And this is what I found to be really useful. What he calls a frozen futurism resulting from the economic dimensions of globalization. He argues that teaching must follow a living in the now. That is, paying attention to the present. He proposes 3 aspects of teaching in the now. Teaching, he said, must be oriented to the recovery of personal truth. Truth is shared, and finding truth is finding home. The recovery of personal truth is a counter to the disembedding forces and personal diminishment resulting from globalization. Truth as shared refers to a relational orientation. And the third aspect, truth as home, is described as finding oneself at home in the world. Somewhat difficult to relate to for those of us who are mostly find ourselves disoriented and again, finding one's way and finding oneself at home. So grounded in the traditions of hermeneutics, teachers are called upon to be interpreters of culture rather than merely transmitters or managers, and to use dialogue to facilitate the participation of all learners. So my quest to understand more about my own truth sharing and my role as an interpreter of culture at first caused some alarm, as teacher interpretations, or rather misrecognition of culture and cultural difference, are in many cases part of the problem of teaching and learning in difference. These and other questions led me, along with my colleague Rumi Ilieva, to inquire into curricular dilemmas and complexities facing faculty who teach in classes with increasing numbers of international students. We had begun this inquiry a few years earlier with fellow teachers Anne Schofield and Bonnie Waterstone, where we interrogated our complicity in and resistance to neoliberal internationalization through our exploring our third space of teaching. This time around, inquiry was part of a larger, qualitative dominant, mixed method study on critical internationalization, seeking to understand the experiences of faculty, students, and staff at a Western Canadian university. And the study was informed by institutional ethnography, a method of inquiry concerned with the political, economic, and discursive dimensions of social life, which aims to explore an institutional order, in this case, internationalization of the institution, from the point of view of the people participating in and implicated in it. So David Smith's question had led me to return to Aoki. Increasingly, we are called upon to reconsider the privilege of identity in presence and to displace it with the notion of identity as effect. According to this understanding, our identities as teachers or curriculum supervisors are not so much in our presence, rather, our identities, who we are as teachers, are ongoing effects of our becomings in difference. And so I go on to my last prelude, Prelude 5, simply Peter. These are hard paths we tread, but they are green and lined with leaf mold. And we must love their contours as we love the body branching with its veins and tunnels of dark earth. And that's from the poem Waking by David Whyte. Staying with the question of our becoming as teachers, I want to spotlight here the story of Peter, a faculty member in health sciences and a participant in our study on critical internationalization. Peter himself had been an international student and lived in 5 other countries as a student before taking up his faculty position in a Canadian university. Based on his experience, he was an enthusiastic supporter of going elsewhere to learn. For someone who had extensive international experience, however, he did not know the term internationalization and reflected that any activity that involves an international component to it will be part of an internationalization process. He recognized that the boundaries between global and local were blurred and said that almost anything you do will be international at some level. For a university, he observed that it is particularly unavoidable to be international because any knowledge that is being produced in the context of other knowledge, and knowledge today, as he says, is international. This latter belief is a common assumption among our faculty participants, and in a sense, a rather simplistic view of what is normalized and universalized as international. As Noel Goff reminded us, for those of us who work in Western knowledge traditions, a first step must be to represent and perform our distinctive approaches to curriculum inquiry in ways that authentically demonstrate their localness. This may include drawing attention to the characteristic ways in which Western genres of academic textual production invite readers to interpret local knowledge as universal discourse, close quote. There's a rich discussion in curriculum studies internationalization of the global and the local, showing that it must be local first in order to be international. Peter is idealistic about internationalization. He believes that if people everywhere have, quote, to some extent the experience of traveling to parts of the world where culture and language are different, then we will probably have a more peaceful world. This reflects another common view that difference, the exotic other, can only be found outside of one's locale, and that a simple encounter will lead to a deeper understanding of the other. Peter understands international students in depth through his own experience as one. He validates their seeking refuge with each other, emphasizing the constant emotional labor of being different. He says, people like you, people who are like you, they like you for who you are, and where you don't have to either learn something new or pretend that you are something that you are not. Students, he says, they feel isolated and they feel ununderstood and they feel under siege most of the time. Their language is a barrier, their humor is a barrier, their behavior is a barrier. I mean, I still remember, he says, I still feel inadequate, culturally inadequate, very, very often. I asked him how he approached his teaching, and he talked at length about the importance of providing opportunities for students to open up, illustrating, so if I want people to open up their mind, I would try to provide a very diverse group where in some way, acceptance of diversity will be encouraged and rewarded so that people have no choice but to open up. And by opening up, then you learn, and learning is painful and costly. Opening up and being vulnerable is the entry point of learning, but as well, this vulnerability is painful. And it is interesting to me that Peter characterizes learning as painful and costly, a point that he made repeatedly in our conversation, and no doubt something he learned from his own time as an international student. But this is not something he includes in his enthusiastic promotion of international experience. When I pressed him about how he provides these opportunities, he said, yeah, I'm an educational terrorist. It was not a response I was expecting, and terror was certainly not what I would consider as being part of a pedagogical repertoire. Sensing my concern, he admitted that it was a provocative way of describing his pedagogy. He continued, I always tell my students that I would rather make them uncomfortable than make them sleep. So I'm constantly provoking, and I try to be as respectful as I can. It's not always easy, and that may get some people a little concerned. You know, it's intentional. Let me shake you up and let's see how you react. So terror for Peter was getting out of one's habitual ways of thinking, of being terrified out of one's own frame of reference, perhaps even snapping out of David Smith's frozen future imaginary and living in the now. Might this go too far, I wondered, and with all the ways in which we are currently threatened by the terror of being erased, discounted, and in the extreme, resulting in a loss of life itself, is this a useful concept? I let him continue. He says, I ask questions. I always try to ask questions, and I don't answer for them. So if they have to feel uncomfortable, there's an uncomfortable silence. Peter makes great efforts to create relationships with his students, and this provocation is his way in. He encourages risk-taking, and he moves into vulnerability by sharing how difficult it is to reach all of his students and the complicated process of doing so, including facing the incommensurability of cultural difference. He pauses. The student and the teacher have to crack their own epistemologies. Vulnerability shapes learning experiences for the students, and for Peter marks his venturing into unpredictable spaces, his teaching in the now, and the tensionality. Looking more closely at Peter's notions of terror, I come to understand that he's hardly the invocation of fear, but a truth-sharing relationality and his own living in the inter. And so I'm sort of moving on to, my final pieces. So Peter is creating an open landscape of multiplicity, recognizing through Aoki's citation of Deleuze that in a multiplicity, what counts are not the elements, but what there is in between. The between, a site of relations which are not separable from each other. Every multiplicity grows in the middle.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Kumari Beck, for your very beautiful speech. And right now we have a few minutes left for questions or comments. You can just unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question, and I put it in the chat box. I'm not sure how sophisticated the question is. I'm one of those first-year PhD students who probably doesn't know as much as he should compared to everybody else in this audience. But the question I have is, how can or if cosmopolitanism help mitigate issues of internalization of education? Because internationalization also has potentials for deeper meaning and for deeper connections. So I'm curious how cosmopolitanism as an ethic can sort of mitigate some of those issues within internationalization.
Mm-hmm. I'm kind of torn between, and I think I've struggled with cosmopolitanism, going, of course, deeply into Nussbaum and Taylor and so on. But where I get stuck is this notion of cosmopolitanism as a sort of going as more into an elitism, and with its with, I guess, this inability or the inability to sort of go more into the notion of these, what I call the unequal relations and the constitution of difference, which in my view was not very well addressed, or rather in my engagement with it, I was unable to actually address the more deeper contradictions of what it means to engage with from the position of largely unequal relations. But that's actually a huge conversation, and I would encourage you to go down more deeply into that, because I myself haven't quite resolved that. But as I say, I have a discomfort with with where that leads me.
So, Professor, thank you for your presentation. In 2001, Peking University in Beijing, China, initiated a major innovation of their undergraduate curriculum by incorporating the core curriculum of Harvard University in the States, but modified significantly to suit the local taste. For example, the purpose of the core curriculum of Harvard University was to enable students to acquire a better appreciation of different approaches to knowledge. Whereas the purpose of the general education program in Peking University was to cultivate talents to meet the demand of society, essentially social construction. So also Peking University adopted different pedagogies. I mean, during this process of localization, not globalization, many innovators involved struggled and became frustrated. I mean, they wanted to change, but they had to situate within the structure that constrained them. So as you said, local first and global second, kind of. I mean, I wonder if we can have a curriculum that can maintain the original flavor as, you know, they have wished, not totally changed by local factors during this process of translation from one context to another.
To me, there are so many layers in what we could conceive of as even local. I mean, in my own context, what is local? With the almost 500 years of colonization by the Portuguese and the Dutch and the British, we have been scant pressed to figure out what that local might mean. And so I wanted to talk about an experience I had where a team of us from SFU went to Sri Lanka, which is, again, my home country, to work on a teacher education program. And this is precisely what we try to do, is sort of respecting local, what we consider local knowledges. And we had a diverse team. And so our hope was to meet with the Sri Lankan team to experiment and to figure out how we both could come up more about, sort of focus more on how a teacher education program could meet the needs of teachers in that context for that time, rather than focus mostly on what was culturally local, what was culturally global, so rather than sort of approach it from the notion of cultural difference, we focused more on trying to understand what the teachers' needs were at that time. So I think in terms of your question, I am more, with my experience, more in favor of, again, theorizing again what Aoki talks about in terms of entering that space of the between, right? How could we conceive of, like, even the curriculum as planned, what has gone into that plan, and what are the lived experiences that we can draw in to create other layers of the between, rather than having this, again, this fixed notion of the space that we are entering as only constituting what we have in this imaginary of what we consider to be an original local or an original culture, which we're always, if we consider that we're always in the becoming, that is ever evolving. And I think it's a very difficult place to be as well, because we all want to have some kind of certainty. And at the rate that, you know, we're all changing, and all of these other factors that come into play, we always want to have some kind of anchor, right? That kind of sort of roots us. And so, so we're caught up in this wish to have some kind of certainty, but at the same time to embrace what is the discomfort of the unknown.
Thank you. Thank you.
Considering about the time, I think we have one more question. We have time for one more question. So, Dr. Beck, considering there's no question right now, I have a question, and I think your presentation is very beautiful and also connecting Tadaoki and David Smith work, and it reminds me of Dr. Piner's comment on the future is in the past. We are talking about the David Smith's frozen futurism, and the future is in the past, and the now seems to be like Tadaoki's lingering on the bridge. So it's like the transforming space of the now. And do you think the now is situated in the past as well, or like the now is more in between liminal unsure space you have to unpack, or like the past, the future, and the now, we tend to understand it in a linear way, but for me, sometimes it's not linear, it's interwoven. So
yeah.
I hope to hear your comments or thoughts.
That is there's such an insightful way of expressing it, because I mean, from my own experience of what the now is always imbued with the past, but also the now is sort of we can't avoid looking at how where we are going sort of influences. So this influences how we even imagine of the now, right? So this constant sort of fluidity between even understanding what the teaching of, so this is why I think this teaching so living in the now and the teaching in the now becomes so much a part of what Aoki calls the sort of the reach, the reaching into uncertainty, right? That it becomes, and so this is why I think we fall back on the plan, because it takes a certain amount of energy and awareness and almost a hypervigilance, because our now, the living in the now, is so much factored in with so many external factors that it becomes almost the impossibility of living in the now. And I think that is an area that I'm greatly wanting to sort of continue to explore, because is it unrealistic to be holding ourselves in such great tension that we are taken away from what I think, for me, the grounding piece is the relationality. So, when both the truth is shared, David Smith talks about the truth is shared, that to me is what keeps us in the now and the teaching in the now, because it is from that relationship that I get my feedback or the signals or the connection into even imagining what could come next.
Thank you very much, Dr. Beck. I think I will close today's session. And before I do that, I hope to thank Dr. Beck again for your very intriguing speech. And I hope to thank Dr. William Piner and Dr. Anne Phelan for hosting this research seminar series. And I want to thank every one of you for participating in today's session. And so there is an amendment to our schedules. You could access the most up-to-date schedule on our website, curriculumstudiesincanada.ca. Our next session is scheduled on December the 1st, 2020. So we are looking forward to seeing you there. And also, the registration for the 2021 seminar series is now open. So please feel free to register yourself on our website event page. Thank you very much. Have a very good day.
And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.